Well, actually, I do read. I'm not able to get through all of the books all of the time, but I have so much good material to draw on that, yes, I read. General MacArthur, who is one of my idols, if you will.
The American Caesar, as a
Yes,
famous book is called.
and he and I are also related, so his ancestors and mine come from the same area in Scotland. And he made it a point always to spend 2 hours a day, even throughout World War II, to read. He would have books available. He had a huge library that he'd inherited from his father, but he always took 2 hours a day to read. And he read history, he read cultural matters, philosophy, law, in order to stay mentally agile. And I think that's what you have to do. If you don't read, you sort of you're living on old intellectual capital, and eventually that wastes away. So yes, I do try to do the same thing. Some days are better than others, obviously, but no matter what, I try to read.
And at the moment, what is for you personally the most interesting book or the most interesting reader who appeals to you the most?
Well, actually, I just received a copy of a book by a German author, a very notable historian. I don't have the book in front of me. If you'd told me ahead of time you're going to ask me these questions, I would have placed it here. And he studied the events leading up to the decision by Hitler to invade the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
And I was trying to understand what was the thought process, what led people to do something that just a couple of years earlier they had all concluded was a serious mistake and should not be done. And I thought that that would be informative regarding some of the thinking that's going on right now in Washington. And you said you talked about an overview. I think Alexis de Tocqueville, who is a French historian, wrote in 1848, "We are all sleeping at the edge or on the bottom of a volcano."
Mhm.
And I said, I think that's a good description of Washington right now. The difference is that Alexis de Tocqueville understood that, and he was right. That was 1848 before everything began. But the people in Washington don't seem to understand that they are literally sleeping or sleepwalking on the edge of a volcano.
What we see in Europe, I mean, that's my personal impression. And I cannot speak about the whole world. Probably in the United States, there are some similar developments. But my impression of politics, especially in Europe, my impression is that we have some kind of hysterical frenzy. It seems so extreme what happened during the last few years. We had Corona, we had the climate change mania, then we had the entry of the Russians into the Ukraine. Now we have the Middle East, and our politicians seem to be like flipper balls in a flipper machine, jumping from one extreme to the other. I don't know what is your impression of our current times and what could be the root cause of this frenzy, of this mania, of this lack of inner balance and sense of reality, at least according to my perception.
I think the elites, as you call them, I just say the ruling political class, both here and in much of Europe. I say much of Europe because it's very pronounced in Western Europe as opposed to East. Is this political class is largely divorced from its population. That's true here in the United States. I think it's true in Berlin. Certainly, it's true in Paris. Uh, when I say divorced, what I'm saying is that, for instance, they are all talking in Sweden and Finland right now, the governments, that is, about imminent war with Russia. And at the same time, the United States is sending troops, equipment, technology, potentially weapon systems, I don't know, to northern Sweden and northern Finland up near the Arctic Circle, ostensibly for the purpose of quote unquote deterring Russia. Well, and we all know there is no deterrence because the Russians have no interest whatsoever in invading or attacking Scandinavia. And I think the populations are now becoming alarmed because they see the arrival almost immediately, as soon as this NATO business was completed and brought both Finland and Sweden in, of U.S. forces pouring into the country and occupying these remote areas that can only be for one purpose, to position weapon systems and probably intelligence collection with the goal of obviously threatening Russia. And I think the populations are beginning to say, no, wait a minute, we joined NATO, but we didn't necessarily sign on for this. But they didn't seem to understand that part of the agreement was that we be given access to whatever bases we wanted in those countries. This is the sort of thing I think is beginning to happen in Europe. And obviously, I think Chancellor Scholz and President Macron, they're at the end of their respective tethers. In other words, they're close to being removed from power. The populations are discontented now. The populations in France react differently from the way Germans react, but I think they can both agree the governments don't represent their interests. The Germans are struggling very hard to find a new way forward, but it will come to them. The problem in France is they know what the way forward is, and they've just got to get the old leadership out of the way. We have a similar problem here in Washington. We have this supposed election coming in November, but between now and then, people are beginning to figure out, well, this entire economy could collapse. The financial system is already in crisis. And frankly, we could be at war with any number of countries between now and next November, but no one can change that. It's very frustrating.
You are an experienced man. You are also a leader. You have military war experience. You have worked in proximity with high-ranking politicians, not at least the former US President Donald Trump. What is your explanation for this mood of confrontation that our so-called elites are in? Where does it come from that we are stumbling, sleepwalking into these kind of conflicts? Just a little remark. I was at the Vatican the last few days. I talked to many cardinals. I'm a Protestant like you. And they told me, not off the record, it's absolute madness, insanity for Europe to enter into a war with Russia. But where does this headlessness come from, this mood of confrontation? What's your explanation?
Winston Churchill said that success in life consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. I'm not a Churchill fan, and I don't necessarily agree with his definition of success, but I think that's what you're dealing with. The West, collectively, this ruling political class that we're discussing, has moved from failure to failure to failure. And the more they fail, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Iraq. We've retained positions in Iraq as some means of concealing the failure. Our policy of bullying states that don't agree with us has failed. Our policies of sanctioning and bombing people into submission has failed. But the ruling elites know no other way. They know no other way because they are convinced of their infallibility. They're convinced of this globalist ideology, which dictates that the world must be altered and changed or reshaped to suit them. And we all know what their interests are. They want to effectively convert us as peoples into something we are not. That happens through immigration. It happens in our schools. It happens even in the churches. We are supposed to tolerate things that historically we have recognized as fundamentally wrong or evil. All of this has failed, frankly. It is not working. And the less that it works, the more they double down on enforcing their will. And that's what's happening today in Ukraine. That's what's happened in the past. When you take Ukraine, for instance, these people that call themselves Republicans, they're not very different from Democrats, frankly, just put forward a plan that is entitled Plan for Victory in Ukraine. Well, that's a statement of absurdity.
From the Republicans?
Yes. And they are taking a position, which all of the so-called neocons take in both parties, that the failure in Ukraine stems from the fact that we have not provided enough to the Ukrainians. If you look at the vast quantities of equipment, it's not an equipment problem or ammunition, but you don't build armies on the fly. You just don't stand up and say, well, tomorrow we're going to field a brilliant force capable of conquering Russia. That's absurd. Can't be done. It never had any chance of success. But what do you do when you have failed miserably? You don't admit your failure, because if you stand there and say, gosh, I guess we were wrong, all of our assumptions were wrong, then people will say, well, then why are you still in power?
Mm.
So what the elites do, because remember, this ruling class controls the media, the ruling class controls finance, the ruling class controls your governments, the ruling class even controls entertainment in Hollywood. So what do? They double down. In other words, they continue to dig deeper into the hole where they already find themselves. They can't conceive of climbing out of the hole and looking around. Americans in particular have a problem. And when I say Americans, again, I'm talking about the ruling class. Don't connect the ruling class to the broader population. Our population is largely disinterested. It's watching football and following the sex life of Hollywood stars. So most Americans are not engaged. That's a huge problem. It's always been a problem in this country. It has not changed. But the ruling political class is very different. They see the world as something that essentially pays tribute to them. In other words, America to the people in Washington is at the center of the universe. We are the superpower of all time. Therefore, everyone must bow to our will. And our vassal states in Western Europe and the ruling elites in Western Europe are part of that ridiculous set of assumptions. Now, what's happening? Power has been redistributed in the world. We are not the center of the world at all. In fact, I would argue in old Leninist terms that the correlation of forces in the world has shifted decisively against us. And that's not because of anything others did per se. It's largely a consequence of our bullying. People no longer want to do business with us. And it's not just Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. That's all nonsense. There are at least 84 or 85 countries out there. Now, we know the BRICS. Everyone's familiar with the BRICS members. That's a substantial chunk, but there are another 60, 70 nations waiting to join. You have to look at this as resistance to the United States-dominated financial system, which is a burden, not an asset, which seeks to control their commerce, control their economies. They do not wish to be under our control. And as a result, they've also had to build themselves up into something they were never really interested in the past, a serious military alliance. That alliance isn't being signed in some hall of mirrors in Versailles, but it is real. More and more nations are stepping up and saying that's enough. And to this must be added our unconditional support for Israel. Mm-hmm. And whether you like or hate Israel makes no difference. What the Israelis have done in Gaza is criminal. The world knows that. You can talk about it as much as you like in the West and say, oh, no, it's not. You can diminish the extent of the crimes. You can treat the people in Gaza as though they really are animals, which, of course, is the attitude of Mr. Netanyahu and his party, and frankly, most of the Israeli electorate. We cannot do that, but that's what we are doing. We are complicit in it as the United States. And by the way, much of Western Europe is complicit in it. And the West Europeans don't seem to understand there's a difference between what is happening in Israel and what is going on in their own countries. Because we know large numbers of West Europeans do not like the fact that they have admitted millions and millions of people from North Africa and the Middle East. Well, of course not. We are allowing millions to flood into our country. It's only a matter of time until that explodes here. But the bottom line is that's separate and distinct from what's happening in Israel, because the Israelis are, in effect, conducting a campaign of mass expulsion and destruction against that population. So all of these contradictions work together to isolate us. And right now, the United States is perhaps more isolated than it has ever been in its history, which is kind of entertaining if you stop and think about it, because people like me that have always opposed these overseas interventions are called isolationists. But we were never interested in isolating the country. We wanted to do business with everyone. Our position was, why are we interfering in the internal affairs of others? But now we really are isolated, and it's only going to get worse from here.
The dark absurdity of unintended consequences. So fascinating what you are laying out here. Public enemy number one of this ruling class in the United States is the former president, Donald Trump. It's amazing. I mean, I would have never thought that he had a realistic chance to come back to the presidency. I talked to some people over the Christmas days, Among them, I don't want to quote them, but some people, from the, you could say, international establishment, these people at these conferences, and they are not totally friends of Donald Trump, but they are saying they think it's quite realistic that he could return to power. How do you see that? And would this ruling class, this powerful establishment in the United States, would they ever let it happen that Donald Trump could ever return to power? Or do we have to face a scenario that Tucker Carlson once explained when he said, well, if they don't can bring him into jail, they will probably try to shoot him. I think that wasn't a joke. I mean, I thought he thought it was seriously. Can Trump return to power?
I think it's a real possibility. Anyone who excludes it is foolish. But let's be frank about something. Donald Trump, RFK Jr., and anybody who is on the left that stands up and eventually becomes a candidate, what do they all have in common? They have all, unfortunately, unconditionally supported Israel. And even Trump has said that if he were president in the future, things such as those things that happened in Ukraine would not happen because he would bully the Russians into submission. In other words, I'm strong, I'm tough, and I can force these people to do what we want, which of course is entirely stupid. Now, to RFK Jr.'s credit, he has not said that. He actually takes the same position that I have over many, many years, that our relations with the Russians should be good. There's no reason why they should not be good. We do not have any vital strategic interests that collide to the point where we should be at war with each other. But having said all of that, there are too many globalists in the camps of all of these candidates. So in that sense, I think the population, the broader electorate, still remains isolated from the candidates. There is no one standing up and saying, wait a minute, we live in a world today where our problems as great powers, France, Germany, the United States, take your pick, wherever you want to go, Great Britain, our problems are internal. They're not external. There are no existential military threats to the United States. Russia threatens us only because we have threatened them. And if we stopped, it would stop. China, good Lord, anybody who knows anything about Chinese history knows that they're not going to attack anybody. They've got the same problem they've had for centuries. Too many Chinese. They've got to manage it. That's every morning Xi wakes up and he's not worried about us. He's worried about what he needs to do to hold China together. And right now, between the banking system, terrible mistakes in the central planning system, economically, financially, China is in a lot of trouble. No one ever brings it up. Somebody pointed out the other day that Xi had executed the top leadership of the Chinese Navy, or excuse me, rocket forces. Mm-hmm. Well, that's nothing new. I mean, corruption is endemic in that country. It's everywhere. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. But people are looking at you, gosh, I didn't know that. Well, things don't work. Rockets don't work. Ships don't work. Hulls are faulty and flawed. This is Chinese corruption. Anyone who knows anything about China can talk about it. So there's no threat from China. And the Russians would like to get back to normal business. They'd like to get this war over with. We are preventing that from happening. We are stoking the fires, however weak they may be in Ukraine, to keep this going. And we're convincing everybody through our vassal state leaders in Western Europe to keep up this ridiculous front that somehow or another there's war coming from Russia. It's all nonsense. But the danger is the provocations could ultimately provoke the very thing that we don't want, which is war with Russia.
We will enter in these conflict fields in a minute. Just one last political question concerning the United States. I mean, what does it say about the United States that we are about to face a replay of the 2020 election? I'm not against elderly people in politics. Adenauer was quite aged when he became chancellor in Germany. And of course, elderly people can be strong leaders. Ronald Reagan, he was not in his 20s when he was the commander of the American forces and the president. But what does it say about the United States that we seem to have the choice now between Donald Trump and Joe Biden? This is something that preoccupies a lot of Europeans. They think, are there no other alternatives, no other people? What's your take on that?
I would say, I would say in some respects, we at the moment are a lot like Austria was in the late 19th century. I'm sure some of your viewers will remember Marshal Radetzky.
Sure.
And Radetzky won the Battle of Custoza, was a celebrated hero, and he actually was a very fine field commander, and he was in his 80s. Well, at that point, he should have been retired, but he wasn't. And in fact, as long as he was alive, they kept wheeling him out, almost to the point of put him in a wheelchair and bring him out again to remind everybody that Austria is a great power. It was ridiculous. That's why you have this novel called Radetzky Marsh.
Sure, Joseph Roth, a fantastic novel.
Well, I think there's a great deal of similarity between what is discussed at the end of that novel, the last several chapters, and where the United States is at the moment. Now, we are still far, far more powerful and potent than Austria, there's no doubt about it. But when you look at the gerontocracy that you've mentioned, that's at the top of our political structure, it's a disaster. It all needs to be swept away. We need new blood. But you're not going to get any new blood until there is some sort of upheaval that dislodges these party structures from power once and for all. Because the structures of power in Washington prevent youth, prevent new ideas, prevent people, I would say, of integrity and imagination from ever reaching office. Now, when this happens in a country, you usually get a revolution. That's ultimately what brought Cromwell to power. Mm-hmm. And Cromwell, by the way, was the model for George Washington in the American Revolution. Well, we're at a point in time where people throw up their hands in disgust. However, there's a profound difference. Our economy has not yet collapsed. The financial system is in crisis, but until it tanks, and it will tank, Americans aren't going to pay much attention. In other words, as long as you can afford your one or two cars, as long as you have a house or you have a nice apartment, as long as you can eat, as long as you are relatively satisfied, I'm talking about the majority, nothing will happen. Americans are by nature complacent in this sense. But I would also argue that you can make a similar argument in Germany and in Scandinavia. As long as things are comfortable, people are not likely to do very much. And so you see the money printing, this flooding the markets with more dollars. You see the Federal Reserve buying up our own debt to the point of absurdity. I mean, it's a shell game. And increasingly, fewer and fewer people overseas want to buy our debt, which makes it harder and harder for us to finance the government. So the answer is, when the government cannot finance itself, everything that we have been talking about that is bad will happen to us. Mm-hmm. But until that happens, not much will change.
Don't we see slight symptoms of change? I bring you an example. Harvard University, the president, Ms. Gay, had to leave because of her performance in front of this hearing and because of plagiarism in her scientific work. We see some kind of probably a little downfall of this wokeism in the public sphere. We see in Europe, in Germany now, the protests of the peasants, of the farmers. They're on the streets, they're coming with their tractors, they say, we've had it. The government tries to defame them as right-wing extremists, which even common Germans start to think it's totally over the top, it's totally unjustified. Are these not signs that the so-called ruling class, these establishments, they're somehow falling apart, and sooner or later, democracy, an alternative without revolution will prevail? I'm an optimist, but how do you see it?
Well, I don't agree with your assessment. I don't think things are changing in the way that you imagine. Not yet. If you look at this Harvard president, that woman had no business being president of Harvard University. She had nothing to distinguish her. She was appointed because she was black.
Mm.
That's all.
And a woman.
Yeah, and a woman. But, I mean, the joke, this is 30, 40 years ago, was that if you wanted to be selected as a Rhodes Scholar to go to Oxford in the United States, you needed to be a Spanish-speaking black woman with one leg.
Yeah.
That's been going on for decades. There's a great deal of bitterness inside the United States towards this business of affirmative action. It needs to go away. Anyone who knows anything about Lloyd Austin knows that he had no business being a general officer. It's kind of surprising in retrospect that he was ever commissioned at all. In other words, this is not a Colin Powell who is actually intelligent and articulate and thoughtful. This is quite the opposite. He's no different from the president at Harvard. We have to we have to discard these policies that push people ahead for reasons other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. It's absurd. Just needs to go away. I often point to the basketball, professional basketball. And I always ask people, how many white men do you see on the basketball court in professional basketball? And everybody starts to laugh. Well, you might see one every once in a while, but it's overwhelmingly black. Well, there's a reason for that. They're better.
Mm-hmm.
They are taller, stronger, faster, better. And that's a business. The people that own it want to make money. And so they want the basketball players who are better, faster, and more effective. They don't care whether they're white, black, Asian. It's irrelevant. The fact that they happen to be black is a testimony to their superiority athletically in this setting. All right. Well, most of us think that that same measure should be applied to everything in the United States. Let's put the best people forward. We don't do that. So that's the first thing you have to understand. Until that changes, I don't see anything of significance happening in this country at all. The second part of it, the Germans. You point to the Germans, and I'm a great admirer of German civilization and the German-speaking peoples. But the thing that is troubling is something that Lenin talked about years ago. He said, if I tell the German communists that it's time for a revolution and to come to Berlin and join us, he said, these people will all go to the railroad station and buy tickets on the train, wait for the train to show up and ride the train to Berlin. He said, now, if they were Russians, what would they do? Well, the first thing they do is kill the engineer and take over the train, and then board thousands of people with weapons. And then they'd go to Berlin, take over, shoot at anybody that got in the way. He said, I can never get the Germans to do anything. He said, there will be no revolution in Germany. Well, he was right. That sort of thing wasn't going to happen. And I'm not saying that we're in that kind of situation that requires that kind of action, but the Germans have a long fuse, and it's definitely being lit, if you will, but it's going to burn for a while before it finally explodes. And the longer it takes, the worse it will be. And I think that's the truth here in the United States. The longer we wait to finally take action, the worse it will be for all of us. And as I said at the beginning, we're still a long way from this election in November.
A lot can happen. Ukraine, what's the most interesting and important development that we have to diagnose here? What's your actual take now on the situation? Can you bring us your thoughts, your most important conclusions?
Well, first of all, let's pause for a minute and discuss Washington's perspective. Because as Petraeus, who I think is a failed officer in the worst sense of the word, who became a general officer, should never have been a general officer. And just, he's one of these people who's moved from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm.
David Petraeus.
Yes. One of the things that he likes to say is it doesn't matter what happens in Iraq. What matters is what people in Washington think. Understand that Washington lives on an island. We call it Fantasy Island. All right. And on Fantasy Island, Washington, D.C., people in Washington think that the Ukrainian war has been an enormous success story. Now, stop and consider this. They think that we have actually harmed the Russians. They believe that the Russians are incompetent and incapable of doing more than they have. They refuse to see reality. Absolutely out of the question. I'm not sure that if Russian forces marched through Kiev and all the way to the Polish border, that they would ever come to terms with reality. They are absolutely certain that this proxy war against Russia must continue. Now, that's Fantasy Island's view. And all of this without regard to the Ukrainian people, without regard to anyone there, without regard, I would argue, to Europeans in general. They could care less. All of it, as far as they're concerned, could become a war zone if it harms Russia. Hence, you see the stupidity in Finland, the stupidity in Sweden. So what is it in reality? In reality, the Ukrainian nation is probably dead. Millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians have left the country. They will never go back. The birth rate, which was already low, has now gone through the floor. I mean, people are simply not building families, and families are essential to the survival of any civilization and culture. Now we have the Procurator General who finally admitted in public that the Ukrainians have lost 500,000 soldiers on the battlefield. Gosh, what a surprise. What has General Kuyat said? What have I said? What have others said who have any sense of reality? Ukraine is being destroyed. Now, could Ukraine be in worse shape? Of course. The Russians could have gone in and done in Ukraine what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. There's a difference. The Russians don't want to kill Slavic Orthodox Christians like themselves. They never have. By the way, the Russians don't want to kill Europeans. They want to do business with them. So this is not Gaza. All the terrible war crimes attributed to the Russians have not happened. In fact, if there are significant war crimes, they were committed by the Ukrainian forces, and we know who those people are. The sad truth of the matter is, I'm afraid Ukraine is finished as a nation state, but we will continue to pretend that it's something real until it absolutely is not. And the Russian forces are now advancing across the front, albeit slowly and deliberately. But I think even the truth has finally sunk in Moscow that they're not going to find a partner to talk to. And if they can't, they have to go to the Dnieper River and probably cross it and go into Kiev. And that is something that no one on the Russian side wants to do, because Kiev is practically a holy city in the history and culture of Russia. That is the beginning of Orthodox Christianity.
That's the Jerusalem of the Russian culture.
Yes, and so they don't want to fight in that city. And Zelensky could care less about those things. He's shut down Christianity in Ukraine. He's arrested people for it. This man is worse than the NKVD and the Bolsheviks. So they may still have to do that whether they like it or not. But there's no one in the West right now that's going to admit anything. Now, if something were to change in Washington, then I'm sure that many of the vassal states would go along with it. But I still think the so-called vassal European states are going to have change in their own governments. It's up to the Germans, the French, and everybody else to put an end to it. They've got to do it and got to come to terms with reality. But you and I know you're the voice in the wilderness. How many people get to listen to you, Roger? So what are they listening to every night on television? They're listening to lies, nonsense, fantasy.
Well, we have an encouraging growth of viewers, especially in Germany, and I'm, as an eternal optimist, I think that it starts to dawn on people that all these fantasies, all these illusions, all these goals, that they have not been fulfilled. But the question is, if I understand you correctly, you would argue it has to be the European governments who tell the Americans to stop this whole ordeal? Or do you think that in the near future, the United States will put an end to this situation in Ukraine and tell Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, now come to terms with Russia, we cannot longer support you? Is that out of the picture, or could that happen in Washington soon?
I think in Washington, it's an impossibility. You have to have a complete overhaul in that city for anything intelligent and rational to occur. As I said, the so-called Republicans are on the lunatic fringe with the people on the left. They are out of touch with reality. They just published something called Plan for Victory in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's what the Republicans in the House had done. At the same time, and as soon as I heard that, and I was not alone, I said, well, where's the plan to close the border and restore the rule of law, to enforce federal law inside the United States? There's no interest in that because there's no money in it. Biden is not in control of anything. Biden says, signs, whatever he's told to say or sign. So you can forget Biden per se, no matter how convincing he may sound when he speaks. So who's in charge? Is it Blinken? Is it Mayorkas? Is it Merrick Garland over at Justice? Is it Wray in the FBI? Sullivan, the National Security Advisor? There are lots of people that wield power behind the scenes, and of course, they're responding to donors, people with billions of dollars who want certain things to happen. They want the war in Ukraine to continue. They want war in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. And they think in doing so that they are going to make Israel more secure and more survivable, when I think it's going to have the opposite effect. That's where we are. And until the people that are there are removed and sent away, and we bring in fresh blood, fresh leadership with fresh eyes, I don't expect Washington to change. So that means Europe has to do something. Now, everyone looks at me as soon as I say that and say, oh, come on, Douglas, you know NATO and EU, these people won't do anything. Well, we'll see. Like you, I'm somewhat more optimistic. I think in Europe, things could change sooner than they will here.
I talked to a taxi driver recently in Berlin, and we talked about the United States. And of course, in Germany, they're always a bit careful what they're saying, to a stranger. But somehow we got along quite well. And I asked him, "What do you think about Donald Trump? What is your perspective?" And then he said to me, an intelligent man, taxi driver, he said, "Well, to me, Donald Trump is the last hope of civilization. He would end these stupid wars. That was his promise at the time." What are you saying? Would you say that Donald Trump would stop these wars? And talking about Russia, how big could the influence, the impact of Donald Trump be on Vladimir Putin? They always said they got along quite well. They respected each other. Could Trump bring Putin into a position to find a new partnership with the West?
International relations have nothing to do with personalities. It's always nice when one person can agree with another, but international relations is ultimately about interests, hard interests. When in 1938, Stalin and Hitler decided to sign the so-called non-aggression pact, which resulted in the dissolution of Poland, why did that happen? It happened because they shared interests, not because they liked each other. They both hated each other. The notion that Donald Trump will come in and instantly change anything, I think, is something we need to re-examine. First of all, the last time it didn't work very well. We spent 4 years while tragically he floundered. The question is, has he changed? Will he bring in completely new people? Or are we simply going to see more retreads? In other words, individuals who are part of the problem, part of the Washington swamp, people who already have 1 foot on Fantasy Island. Fantasy Island is poisonous. You've got to get rid of it. So you've got to bring in new people. The second thing is, has he finally discovered the enormous power at his disposal? I don't know. I mean, right now, the presidency seems to be almost irrelevant. Congress, the Senate, and the House have enormous power because there is no one in the White House. What's happened, though, is that the people behind the scenes, some of whose names I mentioned, are in agreement with people on Fantasy Island that are in the Congress, that is the Senate and the House. So can he go in there and can he make profound change? What has he learned? And I'm not yet sure that he's learned the lessons he needs to. And the other thing is that I'm, as an English speaking person, I don't like the idea of people looking for saviors. I hear people say, "Oh, he'll save us if he gets in here." I hate that sort of thing. To my core, I like to think in larger terms, and I always believed in the republic. So I'm disenchanted with the savior or this messianic complex that Americans are looking for someone to step in and save them. It's bad. I don't like it. It doesn't appeal to me. And so I have serious doubts about that. But then again, we'll have to see. I just don't know. And I look at the others, there are no saviors out there.
About many destroyers. Let's talk about Israel. There are rumors, there are talks that from this regional war in Gaza and in Israel, there could emerge a larger war. How dangerous is the situation in the Middle East right now?
It's extremely dangerous, but it will not explode instantly into a regional war. The people that go back and look at events in late July, early August of 1914 and see parallels are not wrong. But the difference is that the various great powers are moving cautiously, very cautiously, because the only ones in the region interested in going to war are Israel and the United States. Now, you could include the United Kingdom with its Lilliputian Navy and its Lilliputian Army and its Lilliputian Air Force. Those things are almost negligible, but they're probably the single most loyal vassal state in the world to us, not because their population wants it, but that's the nature of the globalist elite in London. But we're not prepared for any of it. Neither is Israel. And I think that there's a tendency to discount the region. People have difficulty understanding just how much has changed in the region. They think that this is still 1973, when the Israelis made a similar error and they were surprised, and then they rebounded with lots of help from us. This time it's different. Why is it different? Because the populations in the region are much better educated. The populations in the region can pick up this, just like you and I, and they can turn it on and they can watch what's happening on the ground in Gaza. The populations in the region are enraged. They do want action against Israel. The problem is that the leaders in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Jordan and Egypt know that their countries are fragile. Their societies are fragile. They don't want to sustain extensive infrastructure damage. But they may not have much choice. So what we see happening right now is a little different from 1914. We just launched strikes into Yemen against the so-called the Houthis, these Shiite tribesmen in Yemen, who are incredibly tough people. I mean, you have to keep in mind that they've been bombed and harmed by us and the Saudis for years, until finally there was some shred of humanity in the United States and people recognized this shouldn't go on. They launched some strikes. What did we do with these strikes? Well, the first thing we did is inform the Houthis that we were striking them. Isn't that interesting? We told them we're coming. We may have told them roughly where we're coming. We seem to have picked targets that we've struck before. Now, I haven't seen a detailed target list. I don't know in great detail, but if you look at the map and you look at the things that they've destroyed and you compare it with what we've attacked previously, looks a lot alike. In other words, it's difficult to believe that we found something new. And I've been through this before during the Kosovo Air Campaign. People bombed and bombed and bombed, and they ran out of targets. And so what did we do? Well, we went back and hit those targets again. What do you do when the bombing campaign doesn't work? And ultimately, that bombing campaign failed. It was our bribing of Yeltsin and his government to support us that persuaded Milosevic to stop, because the Russians called him and said, we can't supply you over the winter. We can't provide you with what you need. You're going to have to throw in the towel because we can't do what we promised. And so I don't know how many billions of dollars Strobe Talbot promised them on behalf of Clinton. I don't know the details. Nobody really does. But Yeltsin and his government said, fine, we'll throw Milosevic and the Serbs under the bus. Mm-hmm. The rest is history. don't see any truth in it. And I think he's trying desperately to do whatever he can to drag us back into the war because he knows that he's effectively on the road to being abandoned. He knows the money is going to stop. The arms have already stopped. The ammunition isn't coming. He's at the end of his rope. So I think he's probably ready to do or say anything that promises to help him in any way.
Yeah. Okay. So by following your work and your contacts, we've learned the truth that millions, tens of millions of Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. They have no plan of returning to the country. 500,000 plus Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or injured. Yet the war continues with Zelensky remaining confident that he can win. Is this Zelensky employing his acting skills, or does he actually believe he can beat Russia and Vladimir Putin?
No, I think he's more sober-minded than that. He's at the end, and he's going to say whatever he can to prop himself up to the bitter end. Who knows what sort of fate awaits him? I think there's a darn good chance that he may not survive in office. He's offended, aggravated, angered millions of Ukrainians. He's led them down the path to total disaster. That usually ends badly for the leader. And then, of course, he's probably got a number of escape routes planned to various places where his bank accounts and homes are located. But, look, this war is over. If you wanted any evidence for that, all you had to do was essentially look at the budget fight over the money. Suddenly now everyone who was pushing war with Russia in Ukraine is now pushing war with the world inside Gaza for Israel. So we've just essentially taken the same chorus, moved it to a different theater. They're singing the same kinds of tunes, hoping for a better outcome. I don't think the outcome is going to be good in either case, but that's another matter.
Do you think, or what would you guess, NATO leaders are telling Zelensky behind the scenes? Do you think that they're saying, "Hey, listen, we've supported you, we've given you more than enough. It didn't work out, and it's now time to get to the peace talk tables"? Or do you think that they are still quietly behind the scenes, pumping him up with confidence that he can win this thing?
I think he's probably being told privately that it's over and that he should probably step down graciously, which I don't think he can do, as I mentioned earlier, in favor of someone else stepping forward that the West can present as a credible representative of the remaining Ukrainian state, whatever that is, to sit down and negotiate some sort of end to the conflict with the Russians. I think any thoughts of turning Ukraine into the contemporary equivalent of Napoleon's Spanish ulcer for Russia are over. I don't think anybody thinks that that's possible. I also don't see much evidence that anybody in Europe wants that to happen. So, we'll just have to watch. Now, I do see evidence that you still have some fighting. The Ukrainians are sort of clinging with their fingernails to the edge of the cliff. And the Russians are now pressing ahead. Anybody who thinks that the Russians are sitting still is wrong. This Avdiivka fight, which is sort of Bakhmut on steroids, I think is about over. After that, I'm not sure there's much left. Whatever Ukrainians are there that still constitute the army will want to retire to the Dnieper River and cross it and get out of the way. The question is entirely up to the Russians. What do they want to do? What are they going to demand? Are they going to offer any terms at all? To whom will they speak? They're certainly not going to pay any attention to anything we say. We've yet to tell the truth to them about anything. So the question is, who can step forward? I don't have that answer. I think they've got to wait, frankly, until there's some turnover in European governments and they have new leadership before they can expect anything from them. So, the tragedy is not yet completely over, but for all intents and purposes, this is the end. In other words, this is similar to the situation that existed after we crossed the Rhine and the Soviets reached the outskirts of Berlin.
Okay. Well, Zelensky has also said that Putin is taking every opportunity to undermine Ukrainian democracy and elections. But isn't it Zelensky that's not allowing elections in order to keep himself in power?
Well, what do you want? I mean, the man's already said that there will be no elections in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. He's effectively banned the Orthodox Christian Church from operating in Ukraine. I mean, just go down the Bill of Rights. Who has any rights left? I'm not sure there are many rights that cannot be discarded with impunity by him. He still has a substantial SBU, or Ukrainian secret police, behind him, which looks more and more like the NKVD under Stalin, rounding up people, forcing them into uniform or disappearing them, if you will. I wonder what's going to happen to this Gonzaga Lira, who is sitting in a Ukrainian jail because he was honest and told the truth about events on the ground in Ukraine. Apparently, he's simply being left to rot in prison. The State Department doesn't seem to be interested in the man, even though he's an American citizen. It's a very tragic situation. But that's a good warning for everybody, including people like me, what you can expect from this administration if you're in trouble.
Yeah, probably because Gonzalo Lira was not beating the drum that Washington, D.C. wanted. And so they're like, we're not going to back a journalist who isn't putting out the narrative that we demand, as if he was Twitter or Facebook or Google or something like that.
Well,
do you think that in the last couple of days there's been multiple drone attacks on the capital of Ukraine? Do you think that Putin and the Russian Federation army have they been attacking the capital this whole time, and it's just now coming into the news, or is this something new as they try to get people to the peace talk tables? What do you think is going on there?
Well, they've launched attacks at targets that they could identify as having some military value or political military value. It's been episodic, but I think they are very definitely ratcheting up the pressure, because the Ukrainian forces are now actually defecting in large numbers. We've always had numbers of Ukrainian commanders that surrendered smaller units because they couldn't evacuate their wounded. They didn't want the wounded to die, and they knew that the Russians would provide them with better care. I mean, one of the problems inside the Ukrainian military from day one has been a very inadequate structure for medical treatment and evacuation. So that that much is persistent. I think they're ratcheting up the pressure because they're going to close in on Kiev. They're going to roll up to the Dnieper River. There's no question about it. Frankly, there's not a whole lot out there to stop them. And I think they have hoped that someone would sober up in the West and step forward and say, let's talk, enough's enough, you've won, let's see what your terms are. But no one's done that. And until somebody does, there is no incentive for Russian forces on the ground to stop.
But from everything you've seen, is this, NATO's been telling us, you watch, they'll go for the capital next, then they'll roll into Poland and Eastern Europe, or is this just the natural consequence of war that, hey, in order to get someone to surrender, you go for the flag, you go for the capital?
Again, I think that is probably on everybody's mind right now in Moscow. But having said that, we've got to keep a certain number of things clear in our minds. First of all, when the Russians initially intervened, everyone said, oh, look at this pitiful force. It's too small for the mission. There aren't enough Russian troops. They don't know what they're doing. Well, they were half right. Putin had never intended to invade and strike all the way to the Dnieper River. I was one of those who was surprised, because I thought that the Russians would behave as historically they've done when it became clear they had no alternative. They would drive hell-bent for election deep into Ukrainian territory to try and rapidly encircle and destroy what was there. That didn't happen, because I don't think Putin accurately calculated the response he was going to get from the West. I think he was surprised. at the enormous hostility and hatred that emitted from Washington, D.C. and other European capitals. So now they've got the force available that could take them all the way to the Polish border without question. But again, it's not really what he wants. The Russians don't want to rule the Ukrainians in the West. They know the Ukrainians in the West are true Ukrainians. These people have never lost their sense of identity or their cultural foundation, their language. They are different from the Russians. The Russians don't want to be burdened with that. Everybody thinks, well, they want to restore the Warsaw Pact. Why? The Warsaw Pact was no great benefit by the time the thing fell apart to the Russians. Cuba is another example. It was a disaster, just an open black pit for Russian money and resources. So he doesn't want to do that. Everything is a function of, well, who's going to step forward and who's going to take ownership, who's going to admit the war is over. That hasn't sorted itself out in the West yet. So between now and Christmas, I would suspect that he'll simply press to the Dnieper River. And that's a natural dividing line. That line will be seized. Then the next question is, who's going to negotiate an end to it? And if nobody comes forward and nobody's left, well, then you can cross the river and go into Kiev and decide what you want there for a government. The Russians will not accept a rump Ukraine as a member of NATO. Off the table. It's impossible. The Russians will not accept a government in Kiev that is incurably hostile to Russia. Why would they? In other words, no more platforms for attack against Russia. What they wanted was an Austrianized Ukraine, some sort of state that would be friendly with, but not necessarily hostile to Russia. In other words, it would not be part of a hostile alliance. I think they're going to get it, but we're not there yet. We'll just have to wait and see what develops in Europe. In Washington, nothing will happen. I don't know if people realize it, but just take one look at Washington, D.C. It's paralyzed. It's paralyzed with a mix of arrogance, ignorance, and stupidity, in my judgment. They have failed consistently in every single important category of foreign and defense policy. The defense establishment is in ruins. We can't recruit for an army that can fight. We don't have the resources to send anywhere. We don't have any additional ammunition left. We have to replenish our own stocks. We have open borders. Millions of people have poured into the country. We don't know who they are, but they're increasingly an enormous economic burden. We have a failing economy and a deteriorating financial situation. Despite what you hear on the mainstream media, everybody says everything's great. Oh, there's a bull market. Well, let's all get in there. Forget it. Only a fool would do a thing like that. I remind people that in June of 1929, Secretary of the Treasury Mellon told the American people, "We live in an era of unbroken prosperity. There is nothing to fear." Meanwhile, he was liquidating all of his own stock holdings, investing heavily in gold and cash. And he wasn't the Lone Ranger. People lie. And the bunch in Washington is standing on a mountain of lies. Now they've taken this Israeli problem on, and they've done the worst possible thing. Instead of sitting down and saying to the Israelis, look, we're not in a position to fight a major regional war. We cannot promise you unconditional support. You're going to have to limit the scope of your operations. That may change in the future, but today, these are the limits. Nobody said that. We're back to what we told Zelensky. You have the scientific, industrial, military power of the United States and NATO behind you. You are going to win. We will give you everything. Well, I think that's what Mr. Netanyahu is also counting on. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, wow. We can barely do one war, let alone two, and yet they tell the American people, we're America. Of course we could do two. Yeah, bring on China while you're at it. My gosh.
It's just monumentally stupid.
Yeah. So just a couple of days ago, I had General Michael Flynn on my show. He said one of the things he was investigating before the deep state made their move to remove him from the Trump cabinet, that there was an awful lot of money laundering happening from the Pentagon through military operations. The day before I interviewed him, the Pentagon failed an audit saying we can't account for $3 trillion $3 trillion is the amount of money that they bring in tax collections from every American combined. So do you think there's any truth to what General Flynn is saying, or is it just hard to track money and weapons when you're in the heat of war?
Well, that's a great excuse. The next time I plan to go to war, I can forget about stealing money and plussing up my bank account. I don't know the details. I'm sure he would not say such a thing if it were not true. So I impute credibility to his statement. I think he's on to something. But look.
And now a quick message from today's video sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. In 2020, there were over 5 million auto accidents. That's more than 600 an hour. 600 an hour. And those in an accident may be entitled to more than they think. A few years ago, I was injured in an auto accident. At first, I didn't want to hire a lawyer because I felt bad for the woman that hit me. But I learned from the law firm that they would be going after the insurance company to make me whole and not the woman. Morgan & Morgan have modernized the injury law process so you can submit a claim and communicate with your legal team all over the phone. So if you're ever injured in an auto accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without having to leave your couch. For more information, go to forthepeople.com/Stephen Gardner or dial pound law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. All right, let's get back to today's news update.
No one in Washington is interested in a real audit of anything. We can't audit the Fed. I think you'd have trouble auditing a lot of the senators in their personal finances as well as in the public ones. I think the entire structure of our government has fallen apart. People don't realize how fragile our government is at this point. The rest of the world looks at us and they see the old American brand. Oh, America is powerful. There's no one that can challenge the United States. Its military is all powerful. It's this, that, and everything. Those days are over. That's 30 years ago. That's 1991. Today, everything has changed. We've had enormous demographic changes. We have enormous discontent inside our country with a whole range of people for very, very serious reasons. We don't have societal cohesion anymore. Go back and look at the days of Gulf War I. Look at the attitudes that people held at that point and how people reacted to what was happening, and then look what's going on now. The point I'm trying to make, and I've said this several times, the last thing the United States needs at this point in our history is a war of any kind. We have too much to do here at home. We're already spending $1 trillion plus every year now to service our enormous sovereign debt. You know, normally your creditors, and we have creditors, will come to you and say, look, it's obvious your head's underwater. You've got to cut spending. If you cut spending, we'll restructure your debt to enable you to pay it. That's what you do. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did in 32 and 34. He didn't call it a default. They called it restructuring the debt. Can we do that now? It's probably too late. Who holds most of the debt, internally and externally? Well, that's another lengthy explanation, but let's be frank. The Saudis, the Chinese, the Japanese, the British, other Europeans, they hold most of the debt. Do they ever really expect to be paid back? I think they've reached a point now where they see no evidence that we will ever cut spending. So where are we headed? Steve, we're headed over the cliff. In fact, some people say we've already gone over. And it's only a matter of time until we hit the bottom. When you hit the bottom, that's when everything will change. But until then, people are going to keep doing what they've always done because they've gotten away with it. So I think General Flynn is right. And I think it's the tip of the proverbial iceberg.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, some of this stuff gives me nightmares to read about.
Well, the bad news is that most Americans are still not paying a great deal of attention. Most Americans think things can be handled, or, you know, the government will fix it. I mean, my generation is in receipt of, you know, their retirement checks, pension funds, whatever savings they have. they're all settling in for a comfortable retirement. And I've tried to tell them what happens if the checks stop. What do people do when the food stamps stop? Oh, well, that will never happen. Gee, have we ever heard that before? That will never happen. I mean, Billy Mitchell predicted that the Japanese were the most likely candidate to bomb Pearl Harbor. He made that prediction originally in 1922. It was repeated subsequently. And people at times said, oh, well, that's ridiculous. Why would they ever do that? Well, we're in the same position now. We've grossly underestimated everything, and we're underestimating the Middle East. And this is the real danger that we confront there. It's similar to what we did in Eastern Europe with the Russians. We underestimated the Russians. We decided they were weak and that we were far stronger than we are. We said their society would fragment. Ours is the one in trouble, not theirs. We said their economy would falter, but it's our economy that's in trouble, not theirs. I mean, we just go down the list. So I think we're doing something similar now in the Middle East, and I think it comes at great cost to Israel.
Yeah. But before we jump in there, I want to ask you something. This may be a little silly, but it's a big story in the news today. There's a retired colonel. I don't know if you know him or not. His name is Colonel Carl Nell. He came out today and said that the United States government, the CIA, and secret UFO programs need to come clean by 2030 and share their secret knowledge with each other in order to give the United States an advantage over the rest of the world before it's too late. Any idea who this guy is? Why is a retired colonel coming out and making it sound as if these different entities are all hiding UFO technology that would benefit the United States?
I really don't know.
You don't know him?
No, I
Okay.
assume he's an Air Force officer, but he could be an Army officer. I have no knowledge whatsoever of him. And by the way, the entire discussion of aliens is very obtuse. I mean, I've seen plenty of evidence to suggest it's quite real. I've seen plenty of evidence to suggest it's absolutely nonsense. I am not in a position to judge any of it. So I don't know, but I've learned that a lot of things are probably true that we don't know. And so at some point the truth will come out. Look, we're still arguing over the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that we don't know. And I think once this government implodes, and I think it will, I think it's headed to rock bottom, we may discover some things. We may find out some things. But until it does, everything that you just mentioned is pure speculation.
Yeah. Okay. It was on the front page of the Daily Mail. You're a colonel. He's a colonel. I thought I would just throw it out there. Okay.
So we're not all electronically linked,
Yeah. Okay. Couple of questions, and then I know you have to get off. Since the October attack on Israel, the U.S. military has had an increase in attacks in Iraq and in Syria. Do you think as the Israel-Gaza situation continues that the United States military bases and units will become increasingly under threat around the world?
Well, I don't know about around the world, but very definitely inside the Islamic world. When I was in the building and before I went into the building and I first interviewed with the president for another position, I warned about the situation in Turkey. I felt strongly that we should get our forces out of there. If you go back to 2003, you will remember that the Turks denied us access to moving our forces through Turkey into Iraq. And everyone was shocked. But nobody knows the truth or the historical record. When we first went in to Iraq, the Turks were apoplectic. They were apoplectic because the Turks, of course, regard the Iranians as a rival. They saw Saddam Hussein, for a whole range of reasons, as essentially a bulwark against Iran. They didn't want us to go in there and destabilize the country. And they knew, because Iraq is another artificial construct. It's not a real country in the sense that we think of ourselves in Europe as nations. You could argue that we in the West, in the United States, are an artificial construct in many ways. We weren't always that way, but increasingly it looks that way. But that's not true in the Middle East. Iraq was drawn up along with Jordan and a number of other countries at the Versailles Peace Conference. So they said, look, he may not be perfect, but the country is stable. We can do business with it. We can live with it. And he's focused primarily or disproportionately on Iran. We ignored it. We went back in 2003 and did more damage. We created the Kurdish monster in many respects that now threatens or has been threatening Turkey for some time, despite Mr. Erdogan's best efforts to try and tame that. So the Turks look at us and say, you're nothing but trouble. You've caused us unending heartache. Same thing is true in most of the Arab countries. But I think we need to understand that, and Americans, they don't. We're back to this. So the Americans wear the white hats, we're the good guys. We come in, peace, love, and harmony burst out from every direction. No, it's not the case. So we need to get those troops out. Donald Trump wanted to get them out when I was there in November and December and early January. He wanted them out of Iraq. He wanted them out of Syria. And he was obstructed. He was obstructed by his own party on the Hill. He was obstructed by numerous lobbies because the argument was, well, we have to stay there because of the Iranian threat. Well, the Iranian threat was already in Iraq. The Iranians have been running the show there almost from November of 2003 until the present. We could never have had any modicum of stability in that country if the Iranians hadn't intervened with the Shiites in the south so that we could deal with the Sunnis in the middle by either buying them off with cash or killing them. So the whole thing has been a facade of stability that was never there. We need to get out. Syria is another one. And our positions in these countries are, by any stretch of the imagination, illegal. The Iraqi parliament voted us out back in 2020, said, get out, leave our country. So much for our respect for democracy. We said, oh, sorry, can't do that. We're staying. Syria is another case. We are there illegally. There's nothing there that justifies our presence or control of this tiny oil spot that's up in the northeast of the country. And now we are viewed as unwanted aliens and potentially threatening, not just to the Iranians and the Iranian proxy militias, but by the Sunnis and the Turks. So we need to get out, but we won't get out. We'll stay, and things are going to get a lot worse, and it's going to be very difficult to rescue them. A friend of mine in the building gave me a good comparison. It's a bad thought, but it worries me a great deal. Most of your viewers will not remember World War II and Wake Island. Wake Island was this tiny island out in the vast Pacific. It was important to us for many reasons strategically, but it was indefensible. It was too small, couldn't possibly be defended. We wanted to get troops out, but we couldn't. So the Marines that were on Wake were lost. They were captured and went away. The same thing was true in the Philippines. We tried to get out of the Philippines through most of the 1930s. FDR actually empowered MacArthur with the president of the Philippines to make a deal for neutrality for the Philippines so that we could avoid a war with the Japanese in the event that they decided to seize the Philippines. All of these things failed. So we had 11,000 American soldiers captured on Bataan. We had 1,000 plus Marines and sailors captured on Wake Island. We have a history of this. This is not good. And once the enemy holds your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, what are you left to do? What's your answer? Global war, total war, world war? Why wait for the inevitable to occur? So I think we should get out of all of these places, but I hold the minority opinion.
Yeah. Oof. Okay, just a couple more questions, then we'll get you out. I appreciate your time. Saudi Arabia has called for an end to the carnage happening in Gaza. Prince Mohammed bin Salman has said if Israel doesn't stop these illegal attacks on Palestine and Gaza, that he will wake up the Middle East against Israel. Is this a credible threat? What are your thoughts on his comments?
I think they've already begun the wake-up call. So I think he's absolutely serious. Now, the Saudis and the Emirates, Egypt in particular, several other North African countries, they have a weapon at their disposal in terms of oil and gas. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it has the weapon known as the U.S. Treasuries. If it simply dumps all of the treasuries it holds, that could start a fire sale here because our banks hold vast quantities of these treasuries that were bought when the interest rates were very, very low that now have really no value. If those things begin, that's going to have a huge impact here. But from a military standpoint, the one actor in the region that should be taken very seriously is Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. And I wish people would look at the remarks that he's made over the last couple of weeks. And he said several things that everyone should listen to this man. He is not hot air. He's real. He leads the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. He leads it in North America. He is a believer. He is quite serious. And he said recently, speaking directly to Netanyahu, you, Mr. Netanyahu, are finished. You're gone. We are not talking to you anymore. It's over. Then he said, you, Mr. Netanyahu, are quick to threaten others in the region with your nuclear power. Let me be clear, all the nuclear weapons at your disposal will not rescue you. You will not survive this. And then he said, at some point, Turkish soldiers will fight in Gaza. Now, those need to be combined with what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, because you're looking at two sides of the same coin. One kind is military power. The other coin is primarily economic. You have the Suez Canal. You've got the Straits of Hormuz. What does it take to shut them down and block them? Not a great deal. And then you have Iran. Iran is not like Turkey. Its population is not violently anti-Israeli. It isn't. It's very upset by what's happening. But the Iranians are much more moderate in their views. Unfortunately, though, the Iranians know that if they are to be taken seriously in the region and by the Islamic world, they have to take Gaza very seriously. And they've done that. They have an enormous arsenal of tactical theater ballistic missiles, as well as cruise missiles and unmanned systems. They have enough of them ready to shoot, ready to launch, that they could destroy much of Israel's urban terrain. In other words, its cities. We haven't even discussed the Turks yet. I'm talking about Iran. The biggest mistake we could make would be to attack Iran. And pointing to Iran and blaming them for what happens in Iraq and Syria is infantile. Those militias want us out of their countries. That's what it's about. Get out. You're not wanted. And the people that have been working to bring on a war with Iran for over a decade are saying everything they possibly can, once again, to indict Iran and provoke a war with it. I mean, remember, President Trump went through this in 2019. You had Bolton at the time and Pompeo, McKenzie and CENTCOM. All these people are, well, it's Iran, it's Iran, it's Iran. We literally set them up to shoot down the global hawk and then said, that's it. And oh, by the way, Mr. President, we have the strike packages ready to go. And President Trump said two things. First of all, how many people did we kill with the global hawk? Well, of course, none. It's unmanned. And there was no pilot. Oh, well, then what happens after we launch the strikes? What a great question. What happens if we land troops in South Vietnam? Well, we'll see what happens. We're going in. We're going to march in. We're going to do these things because it's the right thing to do. This is the problem. This is the threat to the United States. The existential threat to our country and our society is no afterthought, impulse, emotion, passion. There is no strategic reason for direct combat between ourselves and Iran. Neither is there any reason for that between ourselves and Russia or between ourselves and China. We are in other people's countries, in other people's neighborhoods, trying to dictate outcomes. That's over. We are not the great superpower of 91, and they have all recovered and become infinitely more powerful economically, militarily over the last 30 years. We need to understand that however much we want to be, we are no longer the center of the universe. We are not the sole sun in this galaxy. We don't seem to want to come to terms with that, Stephen.
Yeah.
And that's our great problem right now.